Welcome to our new series. In this little mini series we're going to be looking at this board here. This is a Seriously Pro SP3mini. Now we've already done a whole series on its bigger brother where we've gone through pretty much everything. So in this mini series we're going to really supplement that main series on the SP3 with what's different about this little guy, because it is quite a bit smaller. The other board was a little bit bigger and you can snap all of these tabs off in each of the corners, and also this board at the end, which is the transponder for the infrared race timing, and get it all working. In this video what I want to do is go through the main differences and give you some quick tips and tricks for this. Now we're going to install this actually onto a cute little frame. This little quadcopter here, it's actually a T-Drones FPV Warrior. Again, we've done a quick little video on this in the past, and that's where we're going to put ours. It's going to be a lovely little fit right in the middle and just big enough for us to have a bit of a goof around with it. However, in this one what I'm going to do is just talk about those main features, and the next video we'll start actually wiring things up. There is going to be a little bit of soldering required. All the pins and the LEDs and whatnot come in the bag, so just like with the Seriously Pro SP3 you are going to have to do a little bit of soldering, and as it says in the manual, lead-based solder and a good soldering iron will save you a lot of heartache. Now all of the stuff we're going to cover in here is kind of stuff that's already in the manual already, but when I read the manual I found that some of the images were a little bit confusing for me, so hopefully this will help distill what I figured out down into an easy digestible way for those of you that are thinking about the board. So the first thing we'll do then is let's go through the main features and talk about the different pieces. Now the board itself is very nicely screen printed. Now you probably just about make it out on here when the camera catches up. There we go. All the pins are kind of labelled so you can see what's going on. And what we'll do in a couple of slides is I'll go through the main features on the front and on the back and kind of point them out to you, because there's an awful lot of connectors on here. You know, it looks like a piece of Swiss cheese, and Dominic Hydra has done a fantastic job of fitting all of this into a very small form factor, but it does mean that some of the things are in slightly different places. So the first thing we'll talk about then are the new main features of the board. Now it does, as we talked about, have a race timing transponder. Now this daughter board at the bottom can actually snap off and then be connected via 3 wires back to the main board and be sighted anywhere. And on here you can install the 2 little infrared LEDs that you get in the pin pack. Now this is used for race timing, so you can put this on the top, and for those systems that it's compatible with, as your drone flies past the timing equipment it will automatically create the timing. Now there is a process that you go through that is actually on the packet. So when you get your packet it will have a special barcode and it will have a special number, which I'm covering up so nobody can pinch mine, and that's what you use to go on. You basically scan that using any app that can read these kind of layouts for the URL. You go in there, you get a couple of numbers, you put them into CleanFlight, and then that's how you do the configuration for the infrared timer. So that's one of the big changes in here. And again, if you're not using it, you can just snap that daughter board off if you want to save the space and weight. We will be playing with that and showing you how to wire it up later in the series. It does also have a built-in 5-volt regulator. These 2 pins here at the top at the back says 2 to 4S battery. There's actually a connection directly, so there's a little 5-volt voltage regulator on here, so you can't run it at 5 and 6S as some of the boards do, but for those of us that run 3 or 4S batteries we don't have to bother about how we power it or getting separate battery eliminator circuits. We can actually just put the battery voltage straight onto the board, and that also means it's all connected there too. Next thing to talk about then is it does obviously use a micro SD card. Now the original Seriously Pro SP3 used non-volatile memory at the bottom, and for those of you that have flown it will probably have found that it fills up pretty quickly. This will take an SD card up to 32 meg, so don't try a 64 or anything else. Personally I'd get something like a 16 megabyte card pop it in here and just leave all the bits and pieces running. In my experience, the flight after you turn off black box or take out the SD card is the one where you have a problem that you needed the log files to try and troubleshoot what was going on. So my advice would be get yourself something like a 16, plug it in and just leave it stuck in there. There are two buttons on the side as well, these two guys here, and these are used for a couple of things. So by pressing both of them in for more than 5 but less than 10 seconds and letting go, we'll put it into DFU mode. You can use them to bind the Spectrum satellites without having to do too much messing about. It's really going to make setup a little bit easier by having these two things on the side, and that's an addition over its bigger brother. We've talked about the fact that the tabs are removable. So here you can kind of see that the board itself, if you snapped everything off, would be that big. If you take off the board as well, it will be really small. So for those really small craft like 180s and things, then this is an option for you, and then it's just a case of mounting it on some double-sided foam or something like that. And because of those tabs, it is obviously going to be a little bit more versatile. We're not going to take the tabs off, however. We're going to leave them as they are, and we're going to mount the whole board as it comes. Okay, so now we've gone through that, let me go through some of the main features here. So let's look at the top first. So the first thing to talk about is that it does support all the usual bits and pieces in terms of receivers. So we have the satellite port up here at the top left hand corner. Now the later ones, as we'll talk about in a second, actually come with a connector that you can solder onto there. Mine was one of the first batches from Hydra, so mine doesn't have it, so I'm going to have to solder to that. Not sure yet whether I'm going to use a Spectrum satellite or something else. I'm tempted to, actually, because I can show the binding procedure for you then. Then at the top two shoulders you have the PWM outputs for 5, 6, 7 and 8. Now you're not going to use those if you're going to use a quadcopter, but if you're going to use a hex or some form of octocopter, then you're going to connect those ESCs to those additional channels at the top. We have the PPM pins, if we're now at the middle on the right hand side, so we'll look at that in a second when we turn it over. So we have the signal plus 5 volts and ground, just like you'd expect to. So if you're using a PPM receiver, you'd put 3 pins in there and connect to those. And then at the very bottom of the main board itself, we have the main connectors for PWM versions 1 to 4, so that's our 4 connections for the 4 ESCs on a quadcopter, which most of us, let's face it, are going to be running. And that last little bit, of course, is the infrared race timer, and hopefully on this image that I took you can actually see some of the screen printing. It is quite busy, but you can see exactly what's going on. So Hydra's tried to make it as easy as he can for us. If we then flip the board over, so we're looking at the back, then on the back the biggest thing you can see is the SD card holder itself for a micro SD, and as I said, I'd probably go something like a 16 on that. You can see the connector at the top a little bit clearer than in the video just now for the LiPo power where you're going to connect. As with all things, whenever you're doing power, it's clearly labelled on here which is positive and which is negative. Always triple check those things before you plug it in the first time. If you get those the wrong way around, the magic smoke will escape and your board will be goosed. There's a couple of other things on here we'll talk about before we talk about the strengthened tabs. The S-bus pins are slightly different. So if we go back to the board, as we talked about, we have all these pins down here that we looked at the PPM pins on the front. So we realized the first 3 were the PPM pins. On the back, what you'll notice is it actually talks about S-bus. So you have the PPM 5 volt ground, and then you have ground 5 volt and the S-bus input. That's what that is. So if we just go back to the graphic, so the S-bus pins are a slightly different set of inputs. Now the reason for that is that because PPM doesn't use a UART in clean flight when you're using PPM as your receiver, it means that By having two slightly different connectors like this, if you're using PPM, it keeps all of the 3 serial ports available for you to use for other things. When you're using something like SBUs or using a Spectrum satellite receiver, it has to use one of the UARTs for the serial port to manage that input. And unfortunately, that means that you lose one of the 3 additional UARTs that we have on here. Now that's one of the cool things on this board, because none of the UARTs are used with the USB port. And for those of you that have used the original board, you'll know that if you use an on-screen display and try and share that with the UART1 that also drives the USB connector, you have to unplug the on-screen display if you're going to use the USB port, because you can't have them both plugged in at the same time. This board doesn't have that issue, and by doing this, what the designers have done is made sure that if we're using PPM, we also don't sacrifice one of those UARTs, and you only connect the SBUS pins and use that UART for serial ports if you actually have to. So that's the way and the reason it's done. It's a little bit confusing because I was expecting the PPM input to be able to do everything. Lots of other flight controllers do it that way, but after speaking to Hydra, I can understand that now, and it kind of makes sense. Top tips for the board before we finish the video. First top tip is, as we talked about, mine at the moment doesn't have the connector for the Spectrum satellite. That will be available on later boards. If you have one that's coming now, in your bag of bits you'll have the connector, so you can solder that on. The board does use a very different method of flashing. It uses a DFU mode to actually get the firmware on here. Now in the manual it talks about this, so you can get into a little bit of trouble. If you are a Taranis user already and you're familiar with things like Zadig and the DFU utilities, then your PC probably already has all the software on it to make the flashing pretty straightforward. Make sure that you're following the instructions in both this manual and the Clean Flight manual that it's linking to. You will have to download the latest DFU drivers onto your machine if you've never done that before, and also look at Zadig and other bits and pieces too. Now we'll cover the flashing in the next video, but I really want to point this out because it could catch a lot of people out that are expecting this board to behave exactly the same way as the flashing in NASI 32 or one of the bigger brother SP3s. We've already talked about the fact that the USB isn't shared with any of the UARTs, and there's been a lot of work on this board to try and make sure that the 3 UARTs don't share anything with anything else. So rather than have to sacrifice one for the USB or other bits and pieces, you don't have that problem. You'll only have to dedicate one of the UARTs to the SBUS connection if you're wiring into the SBUS connector and using that kind of connection, or something like a Spectrum satellite that needs serial receivers, and then of course one of the UARTs will be configured for that, but we'll look at that in the next video. The servo outputs. Now this is something that caught a couple of people out, I understand. So the standard 4 PWM outputs are here at the bottom of the board, PWM 1 to 4 for standard quadcopter, and as we talked about before, PWM outputs 5 and 6 are up here on the shoulder. This is something that you need to be aware of if you're doing things like servo outputs. They will default to these 2 pins up here. Now while we're talking about these bits, if you're going to use these, you'll notice on the back of the board there are these little triangles by the side of some of these pins. The idea for that is, as you are either using these pins holes on the main part of the board, or if you're not using them, to flow solder from that connection onto that triangle to act as a solder support for these tabs so that they don't break off. So you'll notice that they're kind of on each of the removable pieces, so just be aware of that. If you're going to keep all these tabs on, it might not be a bad idea to flow some solder across just to prevent these things snapping off. The binding for the Spectrum satellite we already talked about, and we'll go through that in another video, can now be done with a button press. You still have to go into the CLI and tell it what kind of Spectrum satellite it is, but then you can do it all through just the buttons, which is nice. And the manual that we've just looked at a couple of pages for, I'll put a link in the description so you can go and download it and have a look at it. But the manual and the way it's written is very much written to be used in conjunction with the Clean Flight manual. So you're going to have to use both of those to get everything working. This manual for this board doesn't talk about all the software bits, and similarly the software manual for Clean Flight doesn't talk about all the hardware bits, but by using them together you should be able to get everything working. So now we've been introduced to the board and we have a rough idea of how all this stuff connects up, then stay with us for the next part where we're actually going to flash this guy, we're going to install it onto the quadcopter and get the basics all working, and then we'll continue with some of the extra little bits and pieces like the transponder setup later in the series. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching, please like, subscribe and happy flying.